we appreciate all the work that Pastor Connor put in to putting together this conference this year. And we also really appreciate the work that John Fesko has put in. I think we feel well fed and well tended to. And while I know this is a Presbyterian church, and Presbyterian is from the Latin word meaning not sure whether to clap or not, let's welcome John back as he brings us session 3.
Let me say thank you so much for your warm hospitality, your attentiveness, and the joy with which you have received my wife and me. We are definitely grateful for that. Let me address 2 quick things. One of the things that I do when I lecture is I tell my students, let's do a little housekeeping. So let me do a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. First of all, someone kindly brought to my attention that I said Paul on the road to Emmaus. That's wrong. I was testing you. No, I wasn't testing you. I made a mistake. It's Paul on the road to Damascus. So thank you for kindly setting me straight on that. And then secondly, someone asked a question, how on earth would thousands of people gather together at that council with so many people there? And what would have happened at the Council of Constance is that the meeting itself, when the council actually met, there might be 100 to 200, maybe 300 church officials meeting itself in the actual meeting, but that all of those other people would have been gathered in the city because it was not uncommon in the day for church officials, such as a bishop or an archbishop, certainly the Pope, for a bishop to have 100 people in his household. In other words, servants, attendants, officials. So if we're talking about the Reformation of ministry, that's certainly a huge aspect of the Reformation of ministry, is that the Reformers said, no, pastors shouldn't have 100 servants. That seems to be missing the point of laying down your life, and it has a lot of other people laying down their lives for you instead of you laying down your life for somebody else. And so that would have been why there were so many people gathered together in Constance. Not that they were all cram-packed into one room, but that you just had a lot of other people coming to, either be auxiliaries or to be attendants or to assist the various officials that were there. All right, with that little matter of housekeeping taken care of, let's go ahead and talk about our third and our final topic today, which is, the Reformation of marriage. When we hear of the Protestant Reformation, I think that our minds naturally and rightly go to the 5 solas of the Reformation: sola scriptura, sola gratia, solus Christus, sola fide, soli Deo gloria, that we have the Scriptures alone as our chief authority in our doctrine and life, that we're saved by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, and it is all to the glory of God alone. And so I think it's important that we always rightly give thought to those particular solas of the Reformation. But at the same time, one of the things that I've been trying to do in these series of lectures is to show us how the Reformation has extended beyond these important doctrinal categories into other areas of life, such as wisdom, such as the pastoral ministry. And so in this particular case, I want to say that the Reformation spread its influence and reformed and changed the nature of marriage. Now, again, this is where what we need to do is we need to try to step into the past so that we can have a better appreciation for what we now regularly enjoy and benefit from in terms of marriage itself. And so this is where we want to take a step into the past, because I don't think that it is an exaggeration to say that the Reformation radically changed the understanding of marriage for centuries to come. What we now take for granted as how marriage is supposed to be was not at all the case prior to the Reformation. I think I can put it as boldly as I did with the last lecture, is that marriage was changed during the 16th century Reformation, changing roughly 1,000 years of practice. I think it's difficult for us as Americans to wrap our minds around that. And the reason is because we ourselves are such a young and youthful nation. Our country is a little bit more, a little bit more than 250 some odd years. Don't challenge me on the math. I don't know math. I don't do math. Okay, I'm terrible at math. I can't balance my checkbook with a calculator. Say 250 years. I remember when I went to do my doctoral studies in the UK and Scotland, and it struck me how massively old so many things were in comparison with what we have in this country. Out behind my house, there's a massive oak tree that is in our back alley. This oak tree dates back to the Revolutionary War period. It's that old. And my neighbor, she is married to the homeowner association president, and anytime anybody gets near that tree with any kind of sharp implement, she's all over him saying, "You better watch it. This tree is 250 years old. Don't you endanger this tree." When I went to my university quadrangle where I would walk through to go to my professor's office, it was 500 years old, the quadrangle that I walked through. There was a church that I went to on a couple of occasions that was about half a mile down the road. It was 1,000 years old. And so it's difficult for us, I think, to wrap our minds around something of great antiquity, let alone having marriage be scorned or denigrated or looked down upon for 1,000 years by, of all institutions, the church. And so this is why we want to give thought to how the Reformation changed the nature of marriage. And so first we want to give a little bit of thought to the nature of marriage prior to the Reformation. We want to fill in some of those details. And then we want to give thought to what Martin Luther had to say about marriage. And while Luther is not the only reformer that influenced the changes that would come about with our understanding of marriage, he's certainly one of the better known figures, and so that's why we want to look to him. So let's give first thought here to marriage before the Reformation, in that there were a number of different influences that caused people from the early church all the way up to the Reformation to look down upon marriage for various reasons. The first of which was asceticism. Asceticism is the idea that you cannot in any way indulge the body in any type of pleasure because the body is not as important as the soul. The soul is spiritual, therefore superior to the fleshly body. And when I say indulge the body in pleasures, I'm not talking about sinful pleasures, I'm just talking about pleasures in general. So say, for example, if you were an ascetic and it got a little bit cold, you would say, I'm not going to indulge myself in an extra blanket, because that would be gratifying the desires of my body. If you were an ascetic and you were invited to a party where there was a feast of food, you would say, I'm not going to indulge in this succulent, rich, food. I'm going to refrain from it because that would be indulging in the pleasures of the body. So it's not about sexuality, it's about the pleasures of the body and satisfying those types of desires. And so there were a number of theologians in the early church who said that we cannot and should not become slaves of the body. We should not and cannot become slaves of the body. And so there's one theologian by the name of Basil of Caesarea who said, for example, you shouldn't listen to music, because in listening to music, that could potentially be a form of pleasure, and it could potentially lead to licentious activity and conduct. You should be cautious with the types of smells that you smell. Quote, the mixing with the air of all manner of vapors that bring pleasure to the sense of smell, or the smearing of the body with perfumes, I am ashamed even to forbid. So in other words, if you were a man or a woman, let's say you want to put on cologne, or a woman wants to put on perfume, Basil of Caesarea would say, no, that's indulging the sense of smell. Don't indulge that sense. That is indulging the body. And so we have to be ascetic. We have to deny ourselves. And of course, the same thing with food. Now, let me just make one kind of theological footnote here, lest we let some of these things go unchecked, which is this. I tell my students this on a regular basis. While we should never indulge the flesh, i.e., turn God's good gifts in the creation into idols, we should nevertheless ask ourselves, why does he have us see in color if it's not to behold the beauty of color? You know, I don't know how they do this, but I've read material that says, that dogs see in black and white. Maybe they passed out a survey. Do you, Fido, see this color? Paw here for no, paw here for yes, no. What do you see in black and white? So I don't know how they determine that stuff. All of my science comes from Star Wars. So I don't know how they figure that out. But I find it interesting that as image bearers, God has given us the ability to see in color. That God has given us olfactory senses to be able to smell nice things, whether it's a rose, whether one of my favorite smells in all the world, but I don't want a baby around, a baby. In other words, I feel like my wife and I have put in our time with changing diapers, so, we're all done there. But a baby, a freshly washed baby, and I don't know if it's the baby oil, I don't know what it is, but a baby smells so good, right? Tactile sense. Why is it that he gives us the ability to be able to sense different things, something that is soft, something that is harsh? Why is it that he has given us taste buds so that we can taste good food? Going through seminary, I ate way too much oatmeal. It's what I could afford. So I'd have 4 packs of oatmeal for dinner because it was filling. Didn't taste very good. And I could remember when I would go out and it would be Friday fun night or Saturday fun night, I would roll large and I would go to McDonald's and I would have a 1/4 pounder meal, and that was living it up. But why is it that you have those taste buds? It's because God has given us these things to be able to enjoy all of these things in the creation. So I want to put that check there to say these are mistaken beliefs. They're well intended. They're trying to curb sin, but they're mistaken nevertheless. It's within this vein that theologians of the early church began to commend celibacy. Celibacy. There were a number of theologians who said, for example, that all of the apostles were celibate except for Peter, which I think is a mistaken conclusion. And later, several church councils said that, for example, the Council of Elvira in 306 said that all clergy were required to abstain from sexual relations. Bishops, presbyters, deacons, and others with a position in the ministry are to obtain completely from sexual intercourse with their wives and from the procreation of children. If anyone disobeys, he shall be removed from the clerical office. Because if it's a higher state of sanctification to deny the body, even ordinary pleasures that would be otherwise legitimate to exercise, then you have to have the priest, who is supposed to be an exemplar, refrain from indulging in those things. And thus, the importance and the elevation of celibacy among pastors became one of the church's key emphases. It officially became church practice at the First Lateran Council in 1123. We absolutely forbid priests, deacons, and subdeacons to associate with concubines and women or to live with women other than family members. They were allowed to live with women as long as they were immediate family members, a mother or a sister or an aunt. So basically, the church officially says, you may not have a wife because this is sinful. Now, remember, we talked about priests finding a loophole through this by paying the penance tax if they wanted to have a concubine. But at least on paper, they were not allowed to have wives. They were supposed to be celibate. Now, when it pertains to concubines, again, I want you to think about what type of influence this has upon the church for the average person coming into the church and observing the life of the priest. In that here the priest is supposed to be celibate, and yet the priest still has a common law wife, a concubine, or as I said before, a priest whore is what the people called them. By 1520 in Switzerland, it was estimated that there were some 1,300 children in Switzerland that were the offspring of common law marriages among the clergy. So if I can put a blunt point on this, so that this is what the people in the church would have understood. I'm not trying to be provocative. I'm just trying to get us to step into the past. 1,300 bastard children of priests living in and around the diocese of Switzerland. What type of an example does that set for the church? What does that say about marriage? What does that say about the goodness of marriage? In fact, here's a quotation from one priest who says this: "Thus I am entangled. On the one hand, I cannot live without a wife. On the other, I am not permitted to have a wife. Hence, I am forced to live a publicly disgraceful life, to the shame of my soul and honor, and to the damnation of many who have taken offense at me. That is, by refusing to receive the sacraments from my hands." In other words, people in the church were aware, you have illegitimate children, you have an illegitimate wife, I refuse to take the sacrament from you because of your hypocrisy. Quote, "How shall I preach about chasteness and against promiscuity, adultery, and sinful behavior when my own whore goes to church and about the streets, and my own bastards sit before my own eyes in the church?" Think about that. There's a sense in which, if this is the packaging, the church's packaging for marriage, marriage at this point in European history, we can say, is in utter disrepair. In addition to this, given the climate of marriage, if marriage was held at a low view, then what does that say about all of these women who are concubines? This means that a side effect of a low view of marriage is going to be a general low view towards women. Women are going to be despised. In the 16th century, 40% of all women were single, 20% of these women were spinsters, 10 to 20% were widows, but women were often the target of witch hunts. Among the 80% of the 100,000 people executed for witchcraft between 1400 and 1700, 80% of them were women. And you say, well, how would this happen? Well, imagine if you were an elderly woman and you walked to your neighbor's house and you asked to borrow some sugar. And your neighbor said, I'm sorry, we don't have any sugar. And as you wander off, you mumble something to yourself. And then the next several days, your neighbor whom you sought to borrow sugar from has one of their children die of the plague. One of the common assumptions in this period in history would have been, it must have been that elderly, disgruntled woman. I heard her mumble something when she walked off. She undoubtedly must have cursed my home, which is why my child died from the plague. So then she would be arrested, she would be tried and examined, and in many cases executed for witchcraft. There was a German proverb, several German proverbs that would go around at this particular point that also illustrate the low view that many people had of women. Quote, if you find things going too well, take a wife. Just for the record, that is an ancient German proverb, not at all my sentiment, okay? Quote, if you take a wife, you get a devil on your back. Another German proverb of the time. Quote, for this reason, one person is observed as saying, for this reason, they say, it would be nice to get married, but how will I live? I have nothing. If I take a wife, things will get really tight. And marriage brings with it many new troubles and cares and requires much effort and work. The wife complains or gets sick. The children wail and scream. This one demanding something to drink, another something to eat. Here, in having to assume these new responsibilities, is truly the greatest obstacle to marriage. So marriage is held in very low view. You don't want a wife, you get a devil on your back. You don't want a wife, you have to deal with wailing and screaming children. This one's hurt, this one's hungry. So not only are women looked down upon, marriage is looked down upon, and within the church itself, the priests, as they are engaged with their concubines, and they're openly engaged in hypocrisy, set a terrible example for the rest of the church. So this gives us a window into the nature of marriage prior to the Reformation. Now let me make one qualifying remark about all of this. This is not to say that every single rank and file marriage in Europe at this particular point was this bad, or that every single priest engaged in this type of hypocrisy. I have no doubt that there were good marriages, there were people who esteemed marriage well, there were priests who were not hypocritical and did not engage concubines, but nevertheless, it was sufficiently widespread enough that the opinions of marriage across Europe were collectively dim. They were collectively dim. Well, naturally, the Reformation would change all of this in many respects. So let's give thought to here our second point, which is the Reformation on marriage, especially through the eyes of Martin Luther. When the Reformation started, many of the theologians of the Reformation, such as Luther, called the monks and the nuns to come out of the monasteries, to forsake their monastic vows. Going back to the last night's lecture when we were talking about evangelical counsels, charity, poverty, and obedience, they would say, these are unscriptural vows. You are under no moral obligation to keep them. The church does not have authority to bind you to these vows. Come out. come out of the monasteries, come out of the convents, and you should engage in marriage. You can engage in ministry and be married. You can pursue a good vocation. Now, just for the record, I've talked a little bit about this with my wife. My wife and I are starting the first Reformed convent for young women for my daughter, because we don't want her getting married to some guy, and she'll be fine just taking care of us. If any of you want to join up, let me know, #blessed. We'll see it later, okay? We'll talk about that later. But as Luther is, calling out to the nuns and he's calling out to the monks, come out of the monasteries, he said, hey, we have to be good on our theology. We have to make good on what we're saying. We have to help these people. So what did Luther do? He helped 15 nuns escape a convent. He was able to get the help of several people. He secured 15 fish barrels, and he loaded the nuns into the fish barrels. This was what happened in The Hobbit, if you've seen The Hobbit, where the hobbits load up into the fish barrels, which must have been smelly, but loaded them up in the fish barrels and smuggled them out of the convent. And so then Luther said, well, now I've got to try to place these young women. And he found some husbands. So here you're going to get married. He found some domestic help positions for others. And he was able to place all of the nuns except for one, Katie von Bora. And his friend said, Luther, you ought to marry her. And he's like, what, are you nuts? No, I'm not going to marry her. I can't do that. And in fact, people around Europe were watching very closely. What are they going to do? Because they wanted to see, will Luther have the guts to act on his theology? Will this discredit him? The world and the devil would laugh, and Luther's work would be undone if he got married. But Luther's friends encouraged him, and he finally decided to get married. And Luther says to his friends, you must come to my wedding. I have made the angels laugh and the devils weep. And so he ends up getting married to Katie von Bora. Now, as someone who got married later in life, I got married in my early 30s, there are a number of adjustments that you have to make. It's like, I can remember thinking as a single guy, I think I'm pretty giving. I think I'm pretty sacrificial. And then you get married and you realize, no, not even close. And especially you would have little things like I would set the thermostat on one level and then I'd walk away, and then 10 minutes later I'd come back. Why is the thermostat up? Who did that? And it took me a good 30, 40 minutes to figure out that my wife and I were having a thermostat battle. We didn't know it. And so we finally resolved that. Those are the types of things that Luther had to adjust to. He said this, quote, there's a lot of getting used to in the first year of marriage. One wakes up in the morning to a set of pigtails on the pillow, which were not there before. So you roll over and, oh, wow, goodness, there's a pair of pigtails there. Katie had to make some adjustments. When she first went to go change the linens for their bed, I don't mean to disgust you. Luther had not changed his bedding in over a year. He's living the bachelor life, or as they say in some circles, living la vida loca. He was like, hey, I'm enjoying life. Why do I need to change my bed sheets? Why do I need to change the straw? You know that bedding probably could have stood up and walked out of his room on its own. So there were a number of adjustments they had to make. Now, let me put this question. I don't want to answer it quite yet. How do these sacrifices and adjustments impact the life of the minister in the preaching and the teaching and the living out of the Word of God? That's an important question. Unlike the great disrespect that many men had for women in Luther's day, Luther loved his wife. His favorite book of the Bible was Galatians, and so he called his wife Katie his little Galatians. He loved to study her. And then we all know the story of the narrative of Adam and Eve, that Eve was formed from Adam's rib, and so he would also call Katie his little rib. You know, he loved her. Katie had to love Luther, who was no prize himself. He had a lot of issues, a lot of health issues as well. He suffered from gout, insomnia, chronic congestion, hemorrhoids, constipation, kidney stones, dizziness, and tinnitus. And if you know, nowadays you can say, here, take some medication. Go to the doctor. Back then, you just had to suffer through it. And so she would have to help him out through all of these various illnesses. So there were a lot of adjustments for both of them as they became accustomed to living as a married couple. But ultimately, the big question is why did Luther marry, and why did this change the nature of the understanding of marriage throughout Europe? Well, Luther wanted to marry, this wasn't the only reason, but it was certainly a big reason. He wanted to live out his doctrinal convictions. Remember the one quotation from the priest that I read, who he knowingly engaged in hypocrisy. Luther did not want to be a hypocrite. And if he taught that marriage was good, that marriage was a gift from God, that wives are made in the image of God as well, then he wanted to make good on that. And he did not want to turn away from marriage if the Lord was putting it before him, and instead he wanted to live out his theology. Luther, for example, wanted young men to understand the goodness of the estate of marriage and the goodness of women. For this reason, young men, writes Luther, should be on their guard when they read pagan books and hear common complaints about marriage, lest they inhale poison. For the estate of marriage does not sit well with the devil, because it is God's good will and work. This is why the devil has contrived to have so much shouted and written in the world against the institution of marriage, to frighten men away from this godly life and entangle them in a web of fornication and secret sins. So just as the reformers sought to reform the ministry, they also sought to reform the understanding of marriage, so that young men, and we can say conversely young women, but so that young men would not look down upon marriage, so that they would not engage in secret sin, hypocrisy, as with the quotation from the priest that I read, and as well as importantly, so that men would honor and love women. This is an important thing. Listen to what Luther says yet again. He says, "Now observe that when the clever harlot, our natural reason, which the pagans followed in trying to be most clever, takes a look at married life, she turns up her nose and says, 'Alas, I must rock the baby, wash its diapers, make its bed, smell its stench, stay up nights with it, and take care of it when it cries, heal its rashes and sores, and on top of that, care for my wife, provide for her, labor at my trade, take care of this, take care of that, and do this and that, endure this, endure that, and whatever else bitterness and drudgery married life involves.'" He says, that's what the world says about marriage. What should I make such a prisoner of myself? "Oh, you poor wretched fellow, have you taken a wife? Fie, fie upon such wretchedness and bitterness. It is better to remain free and lead a peaceful, carefree life. I will become a priest or a nun and compel my children to do likewise." So here, he's fighting against these things. He's saying, don't listen to the world. Listen to the Word of God. And now I want you to listen to how Luther characterizes all of these things. He showed us what these things look like, what married life looked like from the vantage point of the world, as drudgery, as responsibility, as work. But listen to what Luther has to say now. He says, what then does the Christian faith say to this? It opens its eyes, looks upon all these insignificant, distasteful, and despised duties in the Spirit, and is aware that they are all adorned with divine approval as with the costliest gold and jewels. He says, what the world looks at as drudgery and as what is mundane and to be despised, the Word of God says, this is something precious. This is something good. This is something that God has given to us. Quote, O God, because I am certain that you have created me as a man and has from my body begotten this child, I also know that for a certainty it meets with your perfect pleasure. I confess to you that I am not worthy to rock the little babe or wash its diapers or to be entrusted with the care of the child and its mother. How is it that I, without any works, have come to this distinction of being certain that I am serving your creature and your most precious will? From the vantage point of God's perspective, Luther says, do you realize the privilege that it is to be able to care for your wife? Do you realize the privilege that it is to be able to care for this infant child? All of a sudden, that's a very different perspective. Not a drudgery, but a blessing. Not just simply a duty, but rather a joy. He says, oh, how gladly will I do so, though the duty should be even more insignificant and despised. Neither frost nor heat, neither drudgery nor labor will distress or dissuade me, for I am certain that it is thus pleasing in your sight. You know, we've all heard perhaps the phrase, living coram Deo, living in the presence of God, always recognizing that everything that we do in the presence of the Lord, and so therefore whatever we do unto Him. You know, when I was an administrator at the seminary, I would remind myself, paperwork to the glory of God. Paperwork to the glory of God. Pass the next report over. And even in some of the most mundane tasks, I was recently ill, and there was this elder saint at the church who I ended up talking to. And in his very kind and humble way, he said, have you given thanks for being sick? And part of me wanted to say, no, are you nuts? I'll give thanks for when I'm better, but not for when I'm ill. But from that conversation, I've tried within the last number of weeks to start giving thanks for those things in my life for which I'm not immediately thankful for, such as being ill. And I say, thank you, Lord, for making me ill. I have to admit, Lord, I'm not sure why you've made me ill. I'm not sure how this serves your purposes, but at least I know that it's turned me to thank you for every event in my life. That's the vantage point from which Luther was approaching marriage. Don't look at a child as if it is something to be despised. Look at this child as an image bearer, as a precious creature in God's sight, whom He has given you the privilege of inculcating into the gospel of Christ. What a privilege. What a joy. Now, at the same time, as much as Luther could talk about the joys and the privileges of marriage, he was an honest person who was also aware of the challenges. He said, I have not experienced that there is more gall than honey in marriage. So in other words, he said, there's plenty of bitterness in marriage, but not more bitterness than there is sweet times. He says, think of all of the squabbles that Adam and Eve must have had in the course of their 900 years. Eve would say, you ate the apple, and Adam would retort, but you gave it to me. I wonder how many times that conversation went around. 900 years, that's a lot of time to talk about that. Martin Luther was once sitting at the dinner table, and as was his custom, he would give impromptu talks, which is where we have them recorded in his table talk. And so Ligonier Ministries has their table talk ministry named after that, his table talks. And Luther was just expounding with gusto as he was answering a student's question, because they would typically have many students that would come and eat dinner with them. And when he paused for a moment, his wife broke in and said, "Good doctor, why don't you stop and why don't you eat a little while?" And what did Luther say? Luther said, "I wish that women would repeat the Lord's Prayer before opening their mouths." So they were used to exchanging, some pointed words at each other. In other words, Luther is not painting a rosy picture of marriage that if you only look to Jesus, everything will be easy. He was well aware of the challenges. He was well aware of the challenges. And in fact, he once said this. He said, "If I should ever be married again, I shall pray that I shall have a wife carved out of stone because she will listen to me." In other words, he didn't want his wife kind of giving him back his own business. It's like, just do what I tell you to do. It's like, don't we think that? The world would be so much better if everybody would just listen to us and do what we say. And that's what Luther was saying. I'll take a wife out of stone. But at the same time, as much as Luther was aware of the blessings, as much as he was aware of the challenges, one of the chief things that he pursued in his understanding of marriage as he sought to live it out and as he sought to preach and to teach about it is to recognize that he was moving the center of gravity for building the church and for raising Christians away from the monastery and into the family home. Think about that. For 1,000 years, you had people being told, if you want to be godly, you have to go to a monastery. And now Luther and the Reformers are saying, no, if you want to be godly, the home is where godliness is formed. Not at the expense of the church, not at the expense of the preaching of the word, but rather the home was now the anvil where children would be raised and they would be pounded, if you will, into the image of God, speaking figuratively, of course, as the father of the home would inculcate their children in the Christian faith through catechesis, as the father and mother would set an example of godliness for them. Luther says, most certainly, father and mother are apostles, bishops, and priests to their children, for it is they who make them acquainted with the gospel. The center of gravity moves away from the monastery and now into the home. Quote, "There is no greater harm for Christendom," writes Luther, "than the neglect of children. If people want to aid Christendom again, then they should begin with the children like it used to be in the past." In other words, Luther was saying, notice what he's saying here, is the future of the church rests in the raising of children. That's a very different understanding of marriage. So often in the culture wars, we as a church can perhaps be lured into the fray. We often think if we can perhaps see change in Washington, if we can see perhaps this politician elected, if we can see perhaps this law stricken down or passed, then things in the country will improve. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be good citizens and that we shouldn't be civically involved as we're able. But where should we double down? Where should we put the lion's share of our time and in our investments when it comes to seeking to improve the Church of Jesus Christ? Luther would say, right under your own roof. How well are you catechizing your children in the faith? How often are you interceding for them in prayer? How often do you share with them the gospel of Jesus Christ in word and in deed? How often do you love your wife as Christ has laid down his life for his bride, the church? How often do spouses, do wives, submit to the authority of their husbands in a God-honoring way, as Paul says in Ephesians 5, so that they model the church's submission to Christ? You know, so often we're seeking to change the world, and we forget that change begins under our own roofs. And that's the point that Luther was making. And so it's important that we see how this massive change with regard to the nature, the understanding, and the estimation of marriage was reshaped by the Protestant Reformation by theologians like Luther. He says, this sort of thing that caused church fathers to vilify marriage, he says, God has now in these last days brought back marriage to its proper esteem. What does Luther say about marriage? He says, the love of a mother is stronger than all the filth and fevers of a child. In a similar way, God's love for us is stronger than our faith. Though we are sinners, we remain, despite our filth, children of God, nor do we fall from his grace on account of all of our sins. He's saying, in a sense, that the home, the Christian home and a Christian marriage is a microcosmic picture of the Father's care for us as his children. I can't tell you how much as a father I have learned about theology, sanctification, about my own sin by watching my children. I can't tell you how much as a husband I have learned about sanctification, my own sin, and my own need for Christ in the marriage relationship. Again, these are things that were largely absent from the ministry and from the church's understanding of marriage for 1,000 years. But because of the Protestant Reformation, they came back front and center. This isn't to say that pastors all have to be married. That's not Luther's point. Going back to last night's lecture, this would be a thing indifferent. You go as God calls you, and if it's to marriage, then it's to marriage. If it's to singleness, then it's to singleness. And if you're going to be in the ministry as a single pastor, that's a good and blessed thing. I was a single pastor for about 4.5 years before I became a married pastor. So it's not about pastors all have to be married, but rather it's about the goodness of marriage, the esteem that men should have for women, and the esteem that we should all have for the estate of marriage, because it is a gift from God, and it is one of the chief means by which he builds his church, which means that we as the people of God should not only give thanks to what the Protestant reformers had to say about marriage and how they reformed it, we should also be in prayer for our marriages in the church, as well as in prayer for the marriages of our ministers, because we know that they are also under constant attack and threat. And it's when we esteem marriage as God's word tells us we should esteem it, that's when our church is going to have a firm building block in its understanding of the Christian life. I want to quote with this quote from Luther, when he talks about seemingly engaged in some of the most menial tasks in marriage. Now you tell me, when a father goes ahead and washes diapers or performs some other mean task for his child, and someone ridicules him as being an effeminate fool, though that father is acting in the spirit described and in Christian faith, my dear fellow, tell me, which of the two is most keenly ridiculing the other? God, with all his angels and creatures, is smiling, not because the father is washing diapers, but because he is doing so in Christian faith. Those who sneer at him and see only the task, but not the faith, are ridiculing God and his creatures as the biggest fool on earth. Indeed, they are only ridiculing themselves. With all their cleverness, they are only the devil's fools. Let's esteem marriage. It's a gift from God. And let us give a thanks that men like Luther were willing to stand up and not only teach the truth, but even to live it out. Thank you.
Once more, a big thanks to Dr. Fesko. One of the things that we were discussing earlier this year as we were brainstorming topics for this year's conference is how do we show the breadth and diversity in the Reformation, how that addresses specific issues in our lives. And I think we fulfilled that promise this weekend, seeing wisdom, seeing the pastorate, and then also seeing marriage as intimately relevant topics, not only in the 16th century, but also relevant topics for our own lives as Christians now in the 21st century.